wearing dark rimmed glasses. Um, and I have a print short sleeve blouse and shoulder length brown hair. So today we want to talk about the ADA and how far it's taken us as a community and how much further we need to go. But I think as we take in everything that's going on around us, the one thing that I think behooves us to understand as a community is that individuals with disabilities like myself, we are not going back to the way things were for us before the ADA was passed. And so today I'm going to give you a little synopsis of what about what it looked like prior to the ADA passage and afterwards. And then we're going to look forward and really take into account how far we've come, but what more we need to do as a community, whether we identify as a person with a disability or not, to ensure that none of us in the disability community ever have to go back to the way it was. First slide, please. So in this slide, it's just a picture and it's showing you the sit-ins that took place in California right before the passage of the ADA. And so to me, this is symbolizes the movement, the disability rights movement, and it symbolizes the work that has been done across the nation to ensure that people with disabilities have equal rights and that we're treated not only equally, but equitably in our day-to-day lives. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the disability community and everything that's taken place before the passage of the ADA in 1990, we need to take into account that people with disabilities were often institutionalized. We were marginalized, we were stigmatized, and we were denied basic rights, basic human rights and opportunities. And so that manifested itself in folks in our community being placed in institutions. There was no accessibility, whether at work or in the community, whether it was buildings or just in general day-to-day activities in life. There was a lack of accessibility. Individuals were being discriminated at their workplace. Students with disabilities had limited educational opportunities. There was social stigma, there was stereotyping, but most of all, there was truly a lack of legal protections. And so when we think about legal protections, I think what often comes to mind is the Civil Rights Act, right, of 1964 and how it gave protections to so many groups. But disability was not specifically indicated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's why over the years, we've been able to enact laws that specifically address the needs of our disability community. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about how were individuals with disabilities treated, I could go back centuries, but I'm not because that would like the treatment of people with disabilities could be a standalone course in college. But I'm just giving you a synopsis here today. So when we start in the 1700s, if you didn't have money, you didn't get hospital care, which kind of sounds very familiar to our current date and time. And if you were impoverished, right? If you were from a low socioeconomic status, you ended up being houseless and begging in the streets. Once again, there seems to be alignment to what we're currently experiencing. Then we look at the 1750s to the 1870s, which was the Industrial Revolution. And this is when we really started seeing protections come into play. And it started because capitalism, they wanted to protect injured workers. And so laws started getting put in place to protect the workers. But we also saw throughout the US the first school for people who were deaf or hard of hearing, the first school for people who were blind. And then we also had, unfortunately, a big outbreak of institutions that were put in place to truly house, quote unquote, people with mental disabilities or mental health diagnoses. Back then, they called it the term mental illness. which we now try to stay away from, but I'm trying to stay true to the history of the language that was used then. And then from 1840 to 1950, we had eugenics. And so what you're talking about is we're trying to get rid of folks, right? That may have disabilities. So they passed all these laws that were anti-reproduction. We had ugly laws that were put in place where city and county ordinances. For instance, in Chicago, there was an ordinance where if you were walking through the streets and you how you presented yourself, in appearance, was deemed to be quote unquote ugly, then you were put away because people didn't want to look at you. And then there were also immigration laws that were put in place. So anyone that presented with an illness or a disability was not allowed to enter the country. So then we move forward to 1950 to 1999, and that's when we start seeing the protections for the disability community come about. That's when we saw these ugly laws, right, being eliminated. This is when we saw the civil rights laws passed that were specifically, right, to assist our communities. Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right, to help out students with disabilities. And we also saw the Supreme Court Olmstead decision that allows individuals with disabilities to reside in their community. Next slide, please. But I think for us as a network, the Protection and Advocacy Network, the case that really brought home, or the situation that really brought home the beginning of our Protection and Advocacy Network was Willowbrook. And I'm sure many folks are familiar with it, but Willowbrook was a mental health institution that was in Staten Island, New York. And it was originally built for a population of maximum 4,000 individuals. And by 1969, they actually had 6,200 individuals with disabilities residing in this facility. And it wasn't just individuals with a mental health diagnosis, it was also individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they were forced to live in deplorable living conditions. As a matter of fact, in 1965, Robert Kennedy had actually gone to visit Willowbrook, and he compared the environment in Willowbrook to a snake pit. A snake pit. They actually had children residing in this facility that were living in filth. But whomever was residing there was warehoused. There was no other way to put that. They were warehoused. This wasn't a one off. There were other facilities like this throughout the United States. And regardless of where you were warehoused, you were not provided adequate care. You really didn't have a sense of autonomy. You couldn't leave when you wanted to. You couldn't go outside when you wanted to. But most heartbreaking of all is individuals that were housed in these facilities were separated from their families and from society as a whole. And it took years, even after the expose that exposed Willowbrook in the late 70s. It took years to ultimately shut it down. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a little overview of where we were at as a nation when it came to treatment that ultimately came to the notice of society and communities at large. And so the first documented case in the late 60s and early 70s was a case called the Kosminski case. And I have a lot of information on here for you. But the bottom line is this took place in Michigan. And you had a dairy farm in Michigan that was paying individuals with intellectual disabilities $15 a week to work there. They were required to work there 7 days a week, up to 17 hours a day. So, yes, they were paid money, but they held the money away from them, right? They were abused physically, they were threatened with being reinstitutionalized, and ultimately, they were prosecuted. The Ike and Margaret Kosminski and their son John because they're the ones that were holding the two individuals with cognitive disabilities held against their will and forced to work that way. Um, and although the Supreme Court ultimately did away with their process, with them being found guilty, what happened as a result of this case is that we received protection for people who are being trafficked, because in essence, these individuals have been trafficked across state lines into Michigan. Next slide, please. And then we have a case in the 1990s in New York City. And this was the first time that nationwide we recognized that human trafficking existed. And once again, we had individuals, 55 deaf Mexican nationals, who were brought to the United States, and they were forced to sell trinkets for $1 on the streets of New York and in the subway 7 days a week. 7 days a week. And I mean, the folks may have made money off of the Mexican nationals and thinking that it was okay to do this, but it is not. This is abuse. This is human trafficking. And this is the treatment that historically members of the disability community have been on the receiving end of, right? Time and time again, we have been victimized, right? So yes, the traffickers made a $1.45 million in 1996 alone as a result of the victimization of people with disabilities. Ultimately, the ring was disrupted. The Mexican nationals were able to receive assistance. And the reason why it was discovered was that some of them got away and just walked into a police station asking for assistance. And when you think about that, in the 1990s, ASL interpreters were not necessarily accessible in real time in any office or in any precinct. So imagine how horrible the treatment must have been, that they were able to get across the information and seek assistance. Next slide, please. And then we go to 2004, right? So now this is after the passage of the American with Disabilities Act, right? So here we are, we've got the ADA, we have some protections, but we come across this. So there was a Kaufman case. It came to light in 2004. But for over 20 years, we had residents who with mental health disabilities that were in an unlicensed group home were forced to undergo heinous acts amongst themselves and to conduct unpaid farm and housework. And so a member of our disability rights network, Disability Rights Center of Kansas, was able to assist and represent some of the victims of this horrific case. And what transpired in this unlicensed group home is that individuals that were being held there were receiving Social Security benefits, which were being taken away from them. And then the unlicensed group home was also billing Medicare for quote unquote services being provided that were not being provided. And ultimately, one of the residents worked closely with Disability Rights Center of Kansas to change the laws in the state of Kansas to prevent any future abuse and neglect against people with disabilities. So they were able to change guardianship laws and close any loopholes that existed at the state level to prevent any group homes to exist without proper licensing. And it resulted in the creation of an abuse unit at the state level to investigate allegations of abuse and neglect against people with disabilities. So even with ADA in place, there was still a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. And then we go to Iowa in 2013. So once again, this spanned a 20-year limit. I mean, it was over 20 years, right? That we had 32 men between the ages of 40 and 60s with intellectual disabilities. And they worked on a turkey farm. And these men had literally been moved from Texas all the way to Iowa to work on this turkey farm. So immediately you think, oh, we got a human trafficking case here, in addition to abuse and neglect. And although they were quote unquote paid, the money was deducted from the payment that they received to cover their room and board. Room and board, I mean, they're being treated heinously, but they're still being charged to live there, even though they're being held against their will. So ultimately, after all of the deductions, each and every one of these gentlemen only made $65 a month. They were subjected to physical and verbal abuse, and they were forced to live in filth. And it was because of the turkey farm service that ultimately we received additional protections from Social Security Administration on behalf of individuals with disabilities. Next slide, please. So here we have a picture of the mother of disability rights movement, which is Judy Heumann, who is here. And there's a sign that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And that is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. This is one of my favorite pictures of a disability rights march and what the disability rights movement stands for. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the disability rights movement, we need to understand that this movement truly resulted in a cultural shift, right? When we're talking about disability rights, we're referring to the rights of people with disabilities to be treated without discrimination and to have equal access to everyday activities, but most importantly, to be treated equitably, right? And so if we look at this in conjunction with the treatment that the community, the disability rights community, has received, you know, the thought always was, oh, we need to be fixed. We need to be cured. We're unfit and unable to contribute to society. But with the disability rights movement, we were able to align what we were doing with the civil rights movement and work in conjunction with and parallel to each other to ultimately raise awareness about the fact that disability rights is civil rights and that individuals with disabilities should never be institutionalized and should have self-autonomy and the ability to make their own decisions. Next slide, please. So as I indicated, disability rights is civil rights, and it's a hill I will die on. And I say this wherever I go, right? Because the movement was actually a response to systemic discrimination. That's what the disability rights movement was. So we were fighting for equality. We had that grassroots activism. We saw protests across the United States. We saw the sit-ins in California, started in California, right? And it started spreading all the way to the Hill here in Washington, D.C., where I'm currently located. And we saw collective action. So what we know is during the 71 or 72 day, and forgive me if I don't remember the exact number, sit-in in California, we had other groups, other civil rights groups come in and assist, bring clothing, bring wheelchairs, bring food, bring water, set up temporary showers for those that were conducting the over 2 months sit-in at the state capitol in California. So this is what we call collective action. And so we even had the Black Panther come in. The Black Panther was advocating on behalf of the individuals that were conducting the sit-ins and providing assistance. But as a result of this movement, we also saw the legal framework, right? The laws come into play in response to the marginalization of our communities. And so that's when we saw the ADA coming to the forefront in 1990. But then what happened was the ADA was passed, but they realized there was no enforcement tool built into it. So then we had amendments that took place in 2008. And so it helped to change the perception about our community. It helped to increase participation in community life as a result of this. And it guaranteed equal opportunities for people with disabilities in employment, transportation, state and local government services. And I'm just naming a few. There is just so much. But under the ADA, we have what we call Title II. And so that part of the ADA, it covers all programs, all services, and all activities performed by the state and local government. So this allows individuals with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to participate in, but to also benefit from state and local government programs, services, and activities, right? So the onus, the obligation falls on local and state government, the courts, the legislature, the towns, cities, counties, school districts, higher education, you name it. Anything that receives state or local funding or federal funding, they have to ensure that there's equal opportunity and equal access for people with disabilities. And so that is why I always say disability rights is and always remains a civil right. It's not an intersection. It goes, it's, you can't separate one from the other. It's not like, oh, we're like, crossing the street together. No, it's intertwined. It's one and the same. And so getting individuals to honor that and to understand that continues to be a challenge, even today, even in 2025. So it's gotten better. We now have a seat at the table at times when before we were fighting for that seat. We've had the opportunity to work with organizations that are not focused on disability, but might be focused on housing discrimination, employment discrimination, and impediments to medical access that bring folks with lived experience, folks with disability, and advocates for the disability community to the table to discuss reform and how reform must center the lives of people with disabilities. And it must take into account the multiple identities that each and every one of us has. And so within the network, at the PNA network, which Disability Rights Maine is a part of, we consider ourselves a civil rights organization. And we provide training and technical assistance throughout the network. But most importantly, we work with people in the community who have lived experience to give them the tools to be better advocates for themselves. But for us, it's knowing that the sooner other civil rights organizations start accepting the disability community, the better it will be for us to move towards litigation side by side on issues that affect every single member of the disability community. Because 1 in 4 adults in the US currently has a disability. And so for any civil rights organization to argue on behalf of a service or to fight against a discriminatory practice must include us as part of the argument, because we are the fiber, part of the fiber of the United States. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of Audre Lorde, and it's a quote by her that says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And how true is that? Nationwide, we're seeing concerns as it applies to individuals throughout the US that are houseless. But individuals that are houseless, that is not their only identity, right? there's gender, there's disability. Um, it goes on and on. For instance, I am a Latina, I am an immigrant, and I am a woman with a disability. So my life is not single issue. Because I have multiple identities, I experience multiple issues. And so I just wanted to share this quote with you. It's one of the ones that I use all the time, so that you understand as we go through the next phase of this presentation that when we're doing our advocacy, it's not single issued. Next slide, please. So when we talk about not being a single issue, we also have to address the fact that there is a disability justice framework that is used throughout the network, that recognizes that there are multiple disabilities, that some disabilities are co-occurring, but it also recognizes the value of the human, and it values access, self-determination, and an understanding that we are all different, but we all have value. And so we need to move forward on our day-to-day lives, understanding that there are differences in the disability community, there are identity differences, and there are cultural differences. But when we look at an individual, we need to look at the whole person, and not just one of these identities. And we need to provide space for one another for self care, for reflection, but also to have some really hard discussions. Next slide, please. So we think about, I kind of gave you an overview of where we've been, and where are we now? And then what does the future hold for us, right? So we had the start of the disability rights movement, where we had horrific treatment against people with disabilities, which led to laws being passed. But we still saw that even with these laws, there are missing pieces, there are missing areas of protection. And then that combines with the disability justice movement that recognizes that we are, some of our different parts of our different identities, that we have a right to belong, that we have a right to be included, and that we must be treated equitably. So now you take a step back and you look at what is transpiring around us with Medicaid cuts, potential Medicare cuts. Um, we have some laws that are being put in place that will ultimately lead to reinstitutionalization of individuals with a substance abuse disorder or a mental health disorder. And where does that take us? And so that's the next phase of what I'd like to discuss. Next slide, please. So when we talk about, before we even talk about what the next phase is, let's remember the following, right? People with disabilities are full and equal persons under the law. We should have equal access to the day-to-day activities and opportunities. We're entitled to be free from abuse, neglect. We're entitled to not be exploited, as we saw in the cases that I highlighted, to not be discriminated against, to not be isolated. But very importantly, we are entitled to be treated with respect and with dignity, which means that I have the right to determine what is best for me. I have a right to my independence. I have a right to have equal opportunity and to be treated fairly. Next slide, please. And so we're now seeing some current threats, which I've kind of alluded to until now. So next slide. So we're seeing some key players, right? Some folks are reframing people with disabilities once again as needing help, as being incapable or underserving, um, not being allowed. There's concern about our autonomy. We don't make the right choices. There are some concerns that some changes that are taking place in policy may decrease opportunities for our community. We recently saw a passage of a bill that will result in Medicaid and Medicare cuts over time. There is concern in our community that Olmsted and our right to live in our community may be negatively impacted. There is concern about folks being reinstitutionalized. There's been some chatter about setting in place wellness farms or group homes, um, increasing incarceration of individuals, cutting back on teen programs that provide work skills for students with disabilities. And there's also concern with the Medicaid cuts that are forthcoming, that it will have a negative impact on home and community based services. And what does that mean? So I have a right to live at home, I have a right to receive services in my home so that I'm not institutionalized. And even before the passage of this bill and before the identification of potential future impact, it was hard to find home health care because they don't get paid enough. There aren't enough individuals available. And so HCBS services was being put in place to kind of improve outcomes for folks that need home-based health care. And now there is genuine concern that this will be negatively impacted with the potential federal dollar cuts as it applies to Medicaid. And then just last week, we saw the passage of the executive order titled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets, which will have a negative impact on individuals with mental health diagnoses, individuals with a substance abuse disorder, and potentially, you know, some folks have wondered if this is also synonymous with the ugly laws that existed in the past. So that's just thoughts out loud, but it's something that has also been discussed within uh, the circles of disability rights advocates. Next slide, please. So what should we be doing as advocates? So we want to make sure that we're raising public awareness about our community, right? We want to be talking, we want to be visible. We want to be able to tell stories, whether it's our own story about how the ADA has helped us, right? Access employment, has helped us have access to accommodations in the workforce, or has helped to get an apartment complex, an apartment retrofitted in an apartment complex if we're a wheelchair user or if we have mobility concerns. So it's important to raise those stories and say, look, as a result of all of the positive outcomes that are tied into the ADA and the IDEA and other laws, I'm living in my community and I'm prospering. Um, my apologies. We need to show how Medicaid, home community-based services, and community living make independence possible for individuals in our community. Let's educate one another, and let's raise awareness about how Medicaid funds disability services, or what does Olmsted mean. you know, let's use videos and just have conversations with our neighbors. We need to reframe some of the narrative that we're hearing. So instead of saying budget cuts, we could tie that to civil rights erosion, right? Because that's what's happening. Instead of using the word dependency, we need to talk about how disability rights services allow for independence, right? And it makes it possible for accessibility for all. I often, when I talk to people, I always mention universal design. To me, it makes so much sense that anything that is built uses universal design, because as we age, we all develop some sort of disability. So why not build structures? Why not build sidewalks that allow anyone to access the building or to access the public form of transportation? Because then it's just a better life for all of us and not just some. And so let's be able to go out there and tell the stories and raise awareness. Some of us are really some folks in our community are really excited about AI. What does this mean for the disability community? We're seeing assistive technology um, being transformed with artificial intelligence. And so some folks see this as a way to really enhance the ability for people with mobility difficulties to have more mobility, right? To enhance their personal mobility. They're viewing AI and assistive technology as an improvement when it comes to communicating with others if you're a person with a disability. So we're seeing across the nation AI driven smart home devices, right? That's allowing users to manage their environment with voice control, which promotes independence. So when we talk about public policy tools, your tool is your voice, and this is something that you can highlight as a positive for our community. Many folks also perceive AI as creating a more inclusive environment in the future because it will allow individuals to address their specific needs, and may be also able to expand possibilities for persons with disabilities through communication software, voice recognition systems, eye tracking. And so, as we're building coalitions across movements, it's important to raise awareness about the importance of these new developments in technology that may ultimately result in a more inclusive and environment for people with disabilities and will provide them with more independence. And we're also seeing educational tools that are being developed to quote unquote provide equitable access to resources for students with disabilities. But there are challenges there because there are concerns that some of these tools may have bias built into them, which may result in diminished opportunities for students of minority representation. But globally, overall, there is some positive belief that AI will have a significant impact on the disability community. And so we can use those public channels that are available to not only raise awareness, but to also increase any pressure to ensure that we're doing away with some things that may result in a negative impact on our community. But as we work together and we're building coalitions here in DC, the disability community is working with elder justice advocates. We're working with labor and caregiver organizations, folks that are supporting Medicaid expansion, child welfare organizations, LGBTQ and racial justice groups. And I got to tell you, historically, this cross movement did not really exist. And so I am very excited about the future because we have finally reached a point where the disability community and the disability rights movement is being recognized by multiple partners across the United States. Because as we've said, disability rights is a cross movement issue. And so many communities are being impacted. So we can ignore collective action because when we work together, we are all powerful. And so as a result of us working together, we're highlighting stories using social media, we're amplifying advocacy alerts, and if there's any misinformation that's out there, we're also raising awareness about that. We're working together to really hold town halls and trainings to make sure that change is coming and that folks have the tools that they need and the information that they need to make sure that change happens. And most importantly, we're organizing, right? And we're voting. So I don't know if folks realize, but individuals with disabilities are the largest voting bloc in the US, right? So we talk about the Latino vote, we talk about the African American vote, et cetera, et cetera. But the disability voting bloc includes all of those identities. So we are the largest voting bloc in the US of A, and we have the power to make change. And to me, that is the most exciting thing in our future is the fact that we have been given the tools, the accessibility tools, to be able to cast our vote. independently, to be able to cast our vote privately, just like every voter has a right to do. And so, with that power, right, comes change. And that change helps others in our community. And we can serve as an example for those that may not have a disability and may not be voting on a regular basis, to show them, listen, together, all of us, all of our communities together can make changes that'll be a positive outcome, not just for the disability community, but for everyone in our society. Next slide, please. And so at this point in time, I would just say that my goal here today was to raise awareness about the history of the movement and where we're headed to in the future. And although we as a community continue to face challenges, just like everyone, but to more so, right? Because we have more that targets us together as a community, we can fight and push back against this, but we have to be able to provide the tools and the supports that we need. But I leave you with this. Yes, there are some changing tides that may work negatively against our community, but we are not going back. And we will continue to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. The PNA network will continue to fight to ensure that the rights that have been put in place all of these years with all the new laws are not stripped from our community. And we will continue to represent what is beautiful about our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlena. We do have a few questions, so I'm going to go through them and hopefully we'll be able to answer most of them in our remaining time together today. So the first is it's really more of a comment, but somebody said they spoke on the ADA in New Hampshire when it was first passed. So I'm thinking in 1990. They said that their dad in the 70s went to school with the new law and said you are going to teach my child. So I think a strong advocate, and that's from Sarah Trites, who I know well and is a great advocate here in Maine. So thank you for that comment, Sarah. Next question. Have you seen a surge in alliances among marginalized community orgs, given the recent amplification of hate from the current administration? I think you spoke to this a little bit
Yes.
just a few minutes ago. So, but if there's anything you want to add to that.
Uh, yes, wholeheartedly. And in DC, you attack one of us, you attack all of us. And so that is the posture and the position that we have taken. And so we all step to the forefront to work together to push back on any negative, how can I put this? Any negative outcomes that may be coming our way as a result of any administrative changes here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Is there a movement towards returning to the basics of a common sense of humanity, human rights, since so many communities are under threat? And again, I think you touched on this a little bit, but I like this question of the common sense of humanity. I think is really interesting. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little
Mm. Oh my. I'm going to take off my NDRN hat for a second.
bit.
And um, there is there is that sense, right, that humanity, like the treatment of humanity has gone by the wayside. For me, there is a sense of cruelty um, in decisions being made at the federal and or state, local level. And so there is this desire, this passion, this motivation for all of us to work together to ensure that we're centering each individual life and that everyone is being treated with the respect that they deserve, and that we don't abandon the human rights of an individual, right? And that we don't reconfigure the definition of civil rights either. And so we continue to push to ensure that the humanity of each individual is being honored.
Thank you. Next question. How much damage can one presidential administration do to the ADA, or is it out of reach and Congress must act?
Uh, that's a loaded question. Um, Ooh, try not to be political. But let's look at it this way. So, there is this thing called checks and balances, and those checks and balances must be in play. And if they're not synergized and if checks and balances are not being honored, then there will be additional damage.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question is about OCR complaints, I think really about Department of Education. With OCR complaints no longer being processed and challenges finding disability rights lawyers willing to take up challenges, how do we keep fighting for our needs and accommodations as individuals?
So I will say that there are two attorneys at DOJ that are still doing what they need to do when it comes to OCR complaints. And they give me hope. They've also spoken to us and have told us that if any of the 57 protection and advocacy agencies have a case that comes up that requires a civil rights investigation, please reach out to us and we will do what we can, right, to shed light on that need. And although there is a dismantling of the Department of Education overall, some of the individuals that process OCR complaints, a couple of them are doing a detail, right? Over at Department of Justice. So there's still a little bit of folks at the federal level that are looking at these complaints and following through on them. But we as a network continue to advocate on behalf of our clients with disabilities. We continue to do what we can to at least file complaints at the state level to ensure that no one's civil rights is being abused, and we continue to inform the federal government. But we have to continue pushing. We have to continue ensuring that also legal services is on the same wavelength as we are to ensure that all rights must be protected, including those of people with disabilities. And the stronger we are together, the more I believe we can continue to push and try to correct a little bit of the path of this ship that we seem to be in right now.
Thank you. And this is a long one, so I'm going to try and just synthesize it quickly. Somebody says that they've seen a recent study that showed an immune response in people who even just visually saw someone they believed to be sick. This person has seen similar papers throughout the pandemic saying masking or accessibility tools cause stress responses in typical peers. Basically, our existence upset typical folks was the story. Worried about things like ugly laws being used to justify mask bans against disabled and immunocompromised folks in public spaces. So how do we fight back against these journalistic narratives used to normalize and justify disability exclusion to the general public? And I think you spoke a little bit about this in the shaping of narrative, but if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, it's dis and malinformation has been around longer for a long time. It's not just recently, unfortunately. And so the only way to push back on that is to truly put out correct information through the narratives, through stories, through interviews, through articles, through radio, podcasts. We can only fight misinformation with correct information. And there really is, unfortunately, and I wish I was wrong, but it's really hard, right? To get ahead of some of this stuff at times. But I always say I'm not going to allow someone's nonsensical thinking to stop me from doing what I need to do for my own personal health. And while I recognize that in some instances, it puts individuals in harm's way, backing down is not an option, at least for me. But we all have to make our individual choice.
Thank you. Next question is about AI. Some of the flip side, the challenges with AI that's being used to attack communities at the intersection of disability justice. How do we ensure support? How do we ensure that any support for AI specific to accessibility doesn't get kind of lost in other issues of military or police violence in
Mm.
these cases.
So yes, that military police violence, and even in the schools. So that's one of the things that we're concerned about is AI and facial recognition, right? As a result of the fact that we lead the globe on school-based shootings, right? So now they're using facial recognition tools in the schools, and how do we ensure that that is not basically shedding light on misidentification of students who belong to minority groups. And so it's about educating those that are responsible for the technology, right? It's about putting out white papers. It's about, we have some foundations that are currently funding work for disability organizations and tech organizations to work together to educate like folks like Microsoft and other creators of AI tools on how these tools can be used against minority groups and against which includes individuals with disabilities who have multiple identities. And so it's about making sure that the private sector is well aware of the outcome, and also making sure that folks that fund research are also funding research that can push back against the negativity that may be out there.
Thank you so much. And this is a great question. It's something I was talking about yesterday with some folks. But HCBS are significantly lower in actual cost to the state. Person says that they get paid $40,000 per year as a home caregiver, but the group homes receive upwards of $300,000 to $500,000 for the same service. How is it that HCBS are at risk? And again, this is something that it boggles the mind of disability advocates, but if you would love to answer that.
Capitalism? I'm not trying to be funny. There is no rhyme or reason to this. Um, there, I mean, one could say they just don't care. But I don't have anything to validate that other than my own anecdotal evidence. But there is no rhyme or reason, right? And that's why we keep stressing it's like, just if you fund the right services that allows us to live in our communities, to thrive in our communities, then you will have less of a need to have institutions and facilities in play because we have access in the community. But this is across the board, right? Like I'm a lifelong child advocate, and I always used to say like we need to provide funding at the front end of the system and not the back end, right? To give youth and kids all the opportunities that they need to thrive. And the same thing goes to the disability community. Give us the opportunity, therefore put the funding into services in our community to allow us to live at home. We have for youth who have significant medical diagnoses, a lot of parents have to quit their job because they can't find home-based care for their child, but they can't draw down money to care for their child. Can you explain to me why that has to happen? And so we continuously set up systems that have a negative impact on our ability to thrive and to be independent. And that has to stop. And we continue to fight to make that stop.
Thank you. And I think one other piece, and correct me if I'm misremembering this off the top of my head, but with the way Medicaid is structured, it's there's optional versus required coverage, and so that's a concern with HCBS as well, as that could be that optional coverage, even if it's cheaper, may not be
Correct.
chosen as the path.
Correct.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more. I have a few. There's a couple. Just thank you for being here. Comments, so I'll share those. And um, and I think this is a good one to end on. But as a person who provides support to families, is there any way of reassuring families that I work with that we're diligently working to make sure that these protections will remain in place? It's instilling fear in families about what the future holds for their children. And I think that's a complicated question, but then you've spoken to it a little bit already, but it just as leaving us with the hope of what we're continuing to do.
So we're not stopping. We're not going to stop. We continue to do action alerts. So be on the lookout for that on Facebook through the National Disability Rights Network website or the Disability Rights Maine. We continue to work hand in hand with sister organizations to raise awareness, to go up to the state capitol. We continue to sit outside our elected officials' offices. So let folks know that at the national level, all the way down to the state and local level, advocates from across multiple sectors are working together to ensure that these protections are not eliminated and that we are not going to stop fighting. Connect with us on social media. You know, a lot of times you don't know if folks don't have access to social media, then ask your fellow neighbors, right? Like, hey, let's have a chat at the local library to raise awareness about what we're doing out in the community. So it's about connecting to your community members. And for those of us who are connected to social media and are connected to organizations that are doing the work, bringing that information to those that may not be as connected, and connecting families to one another and making sure that they're providing support for each other. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much. And I know we didn't quite get to the last couple of questions, so we'll take those with us and hopefully try to get some follow-up responses for those folks that we weren't able to answer today. But I just want to thank you again, Marlena, for being with us and sharing with the Maine community your presentation today, and for our attendees who took time
Yes.
out of their day to attend this last webinar in our Disability Pride series, and just kind of culminating Disability Pride Month, which feels really important as we fight all of
Yes.
these next battles. So thank you so much, and we'll send follow-up information to our attendees. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and to our attendees, a wonderful rest of your day as
Yeah.
well.
Thank you so very much for having me here today. And thank you for everything that you all do on a daily basis on behalf of our community. Much appreciated.
Thank you.